All right. All right, come on. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Please come on in, find yourself a seat. Plenty of seats right down front. Come on in. Good afternoon. Hello and welcome to the first plenary session in Business and Society this spring 2025. It's my honor and pleasure and privilege to be here among you. Again, you are here this week. Half of the people watching through that lens. You'll be among them next week, but the goal this time and every time is to absolutely make the most of our time together to engage authentically in the learning process. So our agenda for today, again, welcome to you, class of 2028. I've got a few things to say about that. I'll be introducing some of the people who help us make this production possible, including guides, undergraduate, upper class people guides, graduate fellows, and my colleagues. I'll invite them to stand up. We'll say a word or two about the Social Impact Fellows Program. I'm going to preview a little bit the course, and then we offer the stage, our attention to our guest on stage today. Again, this is what Cassandra Bizzaro gave me. I don't know, how many of you can see yourselves in that? Somebody pointing. That was your first orientation week here. Again, yeah. You can see yourselves. People are taking pictures of themselves. That was you then. Here we are a semester into it already. My hope, if I could have your attention. My hope is that you've had a good fall semester since then. Between then and now, you've learned, acclimated to the city a little bit at least, gotten familiar with kind of the NYU rigmarole. Well, this, again, will be another kind of, the entire first-year undergraduate class will have this as the experience to share. I also found this image in the trove of images, and that's the spirit that I want to invite you to adopt here at the beginning, right? This is live theater without a net, right? We don't know where the dialogue is going to go, and the class, hello, Business and Society, the world is changing around us. Things have changed even since I sent you that video a couple, 10 days ago or so. So we have to all be mindful, and here what I want to call out is like this sort of little obstacle thing. I'm not even sure what's happening. Some people remember what's happening, but it looks like, some sort of trust building game to me. Some sort of, obstacles there, but also, and if this person is here, I mean to say this in all, like that kind of like warrior pose sort of thing, like that's really what I want everybody here to adopt, is like we're in the learning process, we're not sure where it's going, but you can proceed with confidence and balance and stamina with the notion that we will find ourselves here 14 weeks from now better for the experience. I am your host every Monday night. We explicitly build on what else you did in the fall semester in Commerce and Culture and the Cohort Leadership Project. We'll be facilitating dialogue. You can contribute your own perspectives. I'm saying this to you now, right out of the gate, session one. We've got a semi-structured interview protocol planned. I've got a set of questions we've prepared. We're going to stay more or less on that path, but we're actually here in the room with you. So if at any point and we reserve the last 15 or 20 minutes explicitly or exclusively for Q&A. But if at any point in the dialogue up until that point where you hear something and you think, I really need to understand that better, you can go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll try to be attentive to that, and I'll call you into the dialogue. So it's in dialogue on stage, but also in the hall, raising your hand spontaneously in the dedicated Q&A times. Yes, there's a discussion forum post. We're doing this for the first time tonight. Before your evening ends, I think the deadline is set for 10 p.m., if I recall correctly. You're all supposed to go on the discussion forum in Brightspace and post a comment or a question in that modality, on that platform as well, so that you can show up for class tomorrow. In my case, it's my 9:30 a.m. tomorrow. We'll see you folks. But whenever you show up, the conversation will already be going. You will have an asynchronous sense of what people were thinking about, what people were interested in when they were sitting here. Faculty will encourage and hopefully challenge you BSP guides will guide you, and thanks, very many thanks to our tech team, without whom we couldn't make this possible. So thanks for making it all happen. We also have, could I have these two people, Krish and Dyrus, stand up and position yourselves. Where are you? They're outside helping people. We have graduate TFs, basically fellows, who are working with and for this class, whose job it is to sort of help us track your attendance. So we're swiping in, you saw that on the way in, and the media site link that other people are watching at now, that tracks you. There you are. Hi. Hello. Hi. Thanks very much. If one of those people happens to, if you find yourself trading crypto or doing whatever you're doing on your phone at any point and somebody taps you on the shoulder and tells you to put it away, it might be one of those gentlemen. Please respect them and everybody else by maintaining the space for learning, allowing everybody to remain attentive during the plenary. These people are your BSP guides, Business and Society Program guides. Can you please stand up? There's 1, 2, 3, yes, 4, yes, right? That's right, thank you. These people, and you're going to say more about this in a minute, so I won't say too much, they're here to help you during this plenary session, and they're also here to mentor social impact fellows. So with that, Christopher and Sonia, could you come forward and tell us, they're also test driving, this is a microphone. Right, these are the microphones that we'll be using, passing around to you when you raise your questions. So we're going to check and see if it works, Christopher.
Testing. All right, we're really going to embrace this. So if you ask a question, we'll toss the mic to you. So kind of an exciting new thing for this semester. But again, hello everyone. My name is Christopher Lee. I'm one of the guides this semester. A little bit about me, I'm studying sustainable business and management with a minor in Spanish. I worked in government at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority within sustainability, and then at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. And then this past summer, I worked in corporate sustainability at MasterCard. And then next summer, I'm going to JP Morgan. So lots of interesting experiences, and this Social Impact Fellows program kind of played a leading role in that, because the main reason I signed up was to put something on my resume. It's like, this will look great. But there is an opportunity for tangible outcomes where you can actually see a project go from start to finish throughout the semester in tandem with the work that you're doing within your business and society class. So if any of you have seen the green wall that's in that lounge over there, that was actually a Social Impact Fellows project that was led by myself and my team. And we worked with administration to secure funding and actually see that project from start to finish. So there are lots of opportunities, and I'll pass it over to Sonia.
Hi everyone, my name is Sonia, and like Chris, I'm a second-time BSP guide and also did the Social Impact Fellows program my freshman year. Our group decided to focus on SDG number 5, gender equality, and the problem specifically that we decided to focus on was the lack of female representation in the startup space. So we created a mini documentary series featuring up-and-coming female startups in hopes of inspiring young entrepreneurs. But the story doesn't end there. Although I did that project freshman year, after maintaining connections with the BSP faculty and the program as a whole, I eventually got the opportunity to speak at the UN, thanks to the Business and Society program. So it doesn't end at the project, keep those connections, and I urge you all to just take a second to look at all of the SDGs. There's 17 of them. I'm sure that one of them will resonate with you, and to just apply to the program and see where it takes you. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Please, thank you. Join me. Again, it's unique to these social impact core courses. We have social impact fellows programs that run basically corresponding to or complementing or supplementing the 4 social impact core courses. So you're seeing this now for the first time. Again, it's faculty led but student guided. It's voluntary. It's not graded. It's basically just extra, supplement, right? To enrich your learning process, to put something on your resume, and to cultivate the skills that will, propel you to positions of leadership. So if you're interested, now would be the time. I'm triggering everybody's devices. I sent this to you in an email. Learn more about the Social Impact Fellows Program and sign up there below. What are we talking about? I said this already. This class is about what's going on all around us. We have thought over the years, what would it be like to teach the class without a syllabus or just like teach it straight from the news. You pretty much could do that, but we haven't kind of summoned the courage fully to do that. It's going on all around us. Business and society are always intertwined. There's a deep history to it. You've already read the history of the American corporation, Gomery and Scylla. It's complicated. That relationship, that complicated relationship, is shaped by a whole series of systemic dynamics that are in great flux. We're going to hear something more about that tonight. But the idea is business can create sustainable value for society. They are intertwined together, and business has a positive role to play. Our goal is to make you agents of that change in this context. The skills that you develop, I'll just say it straight out of the gate, this class is not going to get you your first job. This class will get you your 10th job. Right? The skills to analyze complexity, to sort of understand, to think critically and creatively about this complexity, and to cultivate the persuasive writing and speaking skills that will allow you to exercise leadership. That's the trajectory of this class, propelling you toward a long career in business. We start, this is unit, again, just a quick gloss, unit 1, the complex relationship. We're using Amazon as the illustration of that complex relationship. We're going to hear more about that tonight. Again, unit 2, these global systems that shape that relationship, and closing with unit 3 with strategies for how to create value in and for business and society. Tonight's guest, I'm thrilled. I got this picture off your website, so just at scale, you know, is the one and only Sabeel Rahman, who joins us from Cornell Law School. I'll go the bottom first. For Thursday, you're going to read an article that he wrote about the rise of platform capitalism, platform business model in 21st century capitalism. He's just rolled off a stint down in D.C. Working in the Office of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, in OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. He's been the president of what they call a think and do tank, Demos, working on issues of inequality and other important topics, for previous years. Please join me in welcoming Sabeel to the stage. Okay, and again, we're just going to sort of get into it as we prep for this session, Sabeel. It's a pleasure to have you with us here.
Great to be here.
Very honored to have you with us, and we look forward to learning from your perspective. One of the things in our first phone conversation that you said that you would be interested in doing, and so I'm going to call for it now, is to just level set a little bit. Like, this is our first plenary session. It's a course called Business and Society, the complicated interrelationship between business and other social institutions, including government, including the law. You're a lawyer. Is something that you have spent your career thinking about. So before we're going to end up talking about Amazon and platform capitalism, but before we zero into that space and that firm, and it gives me just great pleasure to look across the room and see people writing notes, I must say, before we get down to that level, at a broad strokes, like historically, the relationship between business and society, how do you start to think about those things, and what do you think the people in this room need to understand about that history and the current landscape in order then to zero in and focus on Amazon and platform capitalism? Please.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, man. And thanks, everybody. This is a super thrill for me. I'm so glad for you all that you have this tremendous semester ahead of you as you prepare to launch your career. So let me enter that from a different angle a little bit, right? So we're in New York. I love New York. I'm from the city. If you think about like the physical city, right? Why is it that we have this lovely space above Grand Central Terminal? That is, there's no building up there. It's like a little oasis in the middle of that part of Midtown, right? Well, it's because there was a law case about that some years ago, which preserved the legal right to natural light coming into the offices around it. Otherwise, that space would have been developed. Two other quick ones, and then there's going somewhere, I promise. The historic patterns of intergenerational disparities in wealth, income, and mobility. Partly the result of urban planning and design, where we place highways, where we place power plants, concentrates poverty in like physical ways. This isn't an urban planning class, but the reason I mention these is because there's like literal brick and mortar reasons why some people have a lot of opportunity, some people have a lot less opportunity, why your lived experience is one way in Midtown and why your lived experience is another way, say, in parts of the Bronx. Law and policy and society is a part of all of that. And now, coming to this context, our macro and microeconomic context, exactly the same thing. It's not quite as visible as the literal 278 highway that like bulldozed its way through a bunch of neighborhoods in Brooklyn when that was built. But it's the same basic idea. So why do we have an economy that, in large, for many sectors, is built on a plethora of very difficult, very intense, low-wage, low-protection jobs, like the Amazon warehouse workers, for example? While at the same time, having an economy that generates supernormal profits and return for certain kinds of investors, but not others. There's law and policy and all of that. The same token, though, is if we want a capitalism that generates broad opportunity, dynamism, uplift for all sectors, right, all segments of society, that too is a product of design and structure. And so for me, coming into all of this, part of why I got interested in the law in the first place, and I got interested in government and advocacy as areas of practice, is to think about that behind the scenes wiring and infrastructure that shapes the individual transactions, individual businesses, individual firms, that then produces over time what we experience as the economy.
Thank you. What I think, just hearing you say that way, maybe you could talk sort of briefly through the history of your own career. Talking about, you say you're from the city, and your career has been focused on this set of issues, but in some pretty different contexts.
Very
so
different
maybe
contexts.
just like
Yeah, sure.
autobiographically,
Yeah, a little
like,
bit of
what's the path
Yeah.
that leads you to this stage?
Every path is different. I can talk about my path. I'm so glad that Sonia mentioned the SDGs and the MDGs. So I got into this in part because of the United Nations, actually. So I was born in New York. I'm a New York kid, but my dad used to work for the UN. And so I kind of grew up all over. And a consequence of which was, for me, like, especially as I was kind of starting to come to terms with what is happening in the news and so on, it was in a developing country context in which the idea of a market economy or the idea of a political democracy that actually works is super contingent and contested and not guaranteed. And that was my experience growing up. Then when we came back to New York and went to high school here and and then went to college and whatnot, it was always with this interest of, why do some systems work well from a normative standpoint in some settings, but not well in others? That's what got me going. Then fast forward when I was my first year in law school, so kind of roughly equivalent to where you all are now in my own trajectory. That's when the financial crisis of 2008 hit, so I'm dating myself. But so the financial crisis hits in 2008, and that combination of what at that point was the worst economic downturn in the US since the Great Depression, plus a pretty big deal, a presidential election at the time, right, 2008. And then watching in real time the policy response, and what increasingly to me felt like a failed policy response to grapple with the instabilities and inequities of early 2000s era financial capitalism, got me thinking about law, policy, advocacy, and in particular, this question of the way we understand what the economy is all about actually plays a huge role in how people respond to it, how people design policy, how people advocate for it. So I'm trained as a political scientist and a lawyer, and my interest has throughout been at this intersection of policy, but also how do we think about the policy? How are we understanding what we mean by inclusive capitalism or by equality or equity, right? And that got me into all of this kind of work.
Well, let me then bridge on that and say again, here we are, first year undergraduates at a business school, right? So the welcome to the university is also welcome to the study of business. And again, the BS in business is a professional degree.
Yep.
Right, so it's a training in the practice of business. It may, and different people have different levels of familiarity with the history of business, with business, the practice of business. And again, we were lucky. We just thank touch wood. The admissions office. Like, you people all got great grades and scored great on tests, and so they're super smart people, who, though intelligent as they may be, may never have studied business as high school students. Maybe you had AP Micro or something like that. So the notion that business is not something abstract. It's not just numbers on a page. It's not a spreadsheet that computes out optimization functions. It's a human social institution that exists like physically on Earth in and among other social institutions that sometimes work for people and sometimes don't.
Yep.
Right, so it makes a difference how you think about it and how you manage it. Just to sort of level set again in that sense, I'd be curious to hear you talk through a little bit the sketch of the history of the corporation that you sketch out in the article that they will read for Thursday. They've read an article about the history of the corporation in America that goes from the Charles River Bridge basically up to around the 2008 financial crisis.
Yep.
But the history of the firm within that legal and social context here in America. If you could take us down that path, please.
So you all will see the article for your classes later this week, as I understand it. But just to, very high level, right? So if you think, what's our standard understanding model of the firm? You have ownership, a board, you have a CEO and management, you have workers, staff, and then you have end users, consumers, what have you, right? People who are using the product. Okay, fair and simple enough. When you actually think about that model, that's actually not how a lot of the economy is structured, and that's because things have evolved over time. So we can think of it as transforming the sort of typical, or not typical, the kind of market-dominant firm evolving through a few different ways. So one is, if you take this basic idea of ownership, management, workers, consumers. One thing that starts to shift, say, late 20th, late 20th century, is a move to stronger investor power, which means that you have a greater demand from investors and boards for shareholder return. One way that firms start to try to meet that demand is to shed as much as possible costs. One of the biggest cost sources being labor. And so you start to see the creation of what David Weil calls the fissured workplace, firms that start to contract out instead of owning, so think hotels, right? If you're, this is now a few decades ago, I'll get to the current version, but if you're, Hilton or whatever, right? Instead of having direct as employees, the janitorial staff to clean the rooms every day, for example, it's cheaper to outsource that function to a separate firm that then handles all of that for you. So you've contracted out a bunch of the functions that you might normally employ. Cheaper for the lead company. What that, though, then starts to generate is gaps in how labor law applies. So now you start to see, as firms contract out more functions, the creation of a low-wage, low-worker protection workforce across a whole different set of sectors. So that's one set of shifts that happens, a fissured workplace. At the same time, another set of shifts happens, which is an increase in financialization. So if you think about the transformations of the financial sector, you start to see more and different kinds of investment products that monetize the returns from firms. This is all happening at the same time. So that starts to change the balance of power between workers, consumers, investors, and managers. What then changes to get to the platform era, which we'll get to next, right, is a couple of things. One, investors, you start to see a new kind of what's called patient capital. So instead of looking for short-term returns, you see the rise of a kind of super investor set of folks, whether it's VCs or others, who are perfectly happy to wait for a long time for their investment to pay a return. That allows the firm to then have more resources to engage in what might be high upfront cost business strategies. So in the early days of Amazon, the idea that you would be able to provide so cheaply a lot of products actually required a lot of upfront expenditure from the firm. Part of how they could do this was tremendous patient investment on the front end. At the same time, so the investment becomes more patient, more willing to wait for a long time to get returns. at the same time, the other thing that changes is that you, because of the way the legal system operates here, and we can talk more about this, we have a kind of a patchwork system of regulations. In some ways, we don't live in one democracy. We live in 51 democracies, right? 50 states and the federal government. The result is you have a pretty big patchwork of regulations across the US. And you start to see firms like Uber, like Lyft, like Airbnb, like Amazon leverage some of the gaps in the regulatory architecture to adapt new business models. And it is the sort of like, I think it was Meta, right, who had the motto early on, move fast and break things, but that's kind of like dispositionally true for all of these platforms. And because of the way labor law works, because of the way other regulatory regimes apply, there are big gaps that could be exploited. The last thing that changes then is for these platform firms, which are not every firm, these are like a small number of firms, the model of success isn't, let's produce a good that generates a good return that meets a demand. There's some of that. But the model of success, actually what they're shooting for is we want to be the platform, as in we want to be the core infrastructure on which other transactions take place. So if you're Uber, you don't want to employ the drivers. And in fact, one of the big battles is whether or not Uber drivers count as employees or not, right? As far as Uber is concerned, they don't. But on a functional level, like Uber sets the terms of everything they do, and that's partly because of a gap in labor law. But Uber's goal isn't necessarily to like serve, have happy customers for every rider. They have that goal, fair enough. But what they really want is a platform on which consumers who are looking for stuff and workers who can provide that stuff meet. And because the platform is the place where this is all taking place, that gives the owner of the platform a kind of infrastructural power, that they can set the terms of that transaction. They run the marketplace, literally, and that is a mode of generating return. It's an entirely different model than I produce a thing that people want and I produce it well. The model is I'm aspiring to be the central monopoly provider of a set of transactions, which I can then control and manipulate to maximize my return, but it might improve the consumer experience, but there are a whole set of constituencies who lose out. And so the last point in the paper that, and I should mention my amazing co-author, Kathy Thielen at MIT, who couldn't be here tonight, but one of the big punchlines of the paper that Kathy and I try to come to is the rise of market-dominant platforms like Uber, like Airbnb, like Amazon, et cetera, in large part reveals a kind of tacit alliance of interests between investors and consumers. So if you think about who benefits from the platform model, the investors get a great deal, right? Because once you're the dominant platform, you now have a very solid set of returns that you're going to get because no one's going to mess with the core infrastructure on which everything else depends. Consumers, all of us, like we are ordering stuff and using these services. They're great. They're very efficient, like, et cetera, et cetera. We get a great deal. Who doesn't? Workers and other producers, because part of what platforms do is they centralize kind of gatekeeping power over who gets to access the market in the first place. And so last thing I'll say, and I'll turn back to you, is if you think about Amazon, right? Great deal for many of us at a consumer standpoint. To my mind, one of the most compelling critiques of the Amazon model is from a producer standpoint. So one of the things that Amazon is able to do, by virtue of its control of the marketplace, is to spot way in advance trends of smaller producers on their website who are selling products that are doing really well. People need to buy lots of replacement charger cables. So it turns out that if you're like a kind of enterprising provider of cheaper charger cables, you can then sell a bunch of stuff on the Amazon marketplace. You're doing a good job. Amazon knows this, and because Amazon has a lot of capital to play with, it then creates its own Amazon-branded charger cables, which it sells at a steep discount to undercut the other producers. Once those other producers are driven off the marketplace, then the price ticks back up. And we have like plenty of examples of this dynamic. I raise it as an illustrative example of the platform serves a number of interests, us in particular as consumers, really, really well, but disserves other potential new market entrants, other potential producers, and we can talk about the workers in a moment. But the point is there's a cost here to the platform model. As we think about the nature of this form of platform capitalism, right? What are its dynamics? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? I think it's important to be clear-eyed about what the model does and doesn't do.
Yeah, I just putting myself in the shoes of folks listening, thinking I need to charge my phone. Like, what's the problem with a cheaper charger cable? So I want to build back up to that.
Yep.
And then talk about, okay, well, the benefits to some, but the costs to others in the economy, basically, and in society. But I want to loop back and kind of sort of go a little more slowly through those three elements that you just cited. Patient capital.
Yeah.
What is that? Who is that? What are the interests associated with that? What is the history? What does that enable a platform business like Amazon to do over time? Just say a little bit more about that, and then we'll go through legal infrastructure and consumer benefits.
Right. That's great. Yeah, we're racing ahead. So any business, right, needs startup capital. That's straightforward. You can think of patient capital as opposed to impatient capital or short-termist capital. Right? Patient capital is willing to wait a long time for a return. If you're a business trying to get off the ground, that's advantageous, right? It means you have more runway and more room to trial and error your way to the thing that you're trying to hit upon. In the old model, so what is sometimes called the golden era of 20th century capitalism, sort of mid-20th century, the model of patient capital was, you go public, you have investors, they're not particularly demanding immediate return. Their money is kind of sitting there as an investment, and so you have runway as a firm. Think this is like the old era of GM. That starts to change in the late 20th century to the impatient capital, the short-termist capital period. That's when you start to see more and more demand and also more and more power on the part of investors demanding a particular rate of return, and that creates a lot of pressure, literal pressure on management to deliver every quarter a level of return, which generates then an incentive to try to change the cost calculus, right, that I mentioned. The modern platform era of patient capital is different. It's a return to patience in a sense. Amazon has a long runway from its investors. But this time, instead of the investors being sort of a broad set of people interested in a kind of wider range of stakeholder benefit, it's a narrower set of investors who are still interested in return, but they're willing to wait a longer time than sort of that short-term era. So an example would be VC. I'm sure there are folks here who spent a lot of time thinking about that. One of the interesting things about the sociology of venture capital, at least over the last, say, 20 years, 20, 30 years, is that if you really drill down for a lot of the VC investments, what they're really after is, they'll call it a unicorn, but what they're really after is a firm that's going to hit it big as a market-dominant firm. So to put another way, they're investing in the hopes of investing in the next monopoly firm. Perfectly rational investment strategy, but a very different set of implications for society.
Because again, they feel like if they can wait, the upside is going to be greater.
If they can wait, the upside is going to be greater, and that thing that is that scenario that is the upside for the investor is a scenario that I would argue, Kathy and I would argue, is actually tremendously harmful for the rest of, for a broader kind of inclusive economy and society.
Unpack that though. Why?
So this gets to a body of research around market concentration and monopoly power more generally. So one thing I should say, you study this for long enough, everything new is actually super old. Literally everything I just said and anything you might talk about the platforms or 21st century monopoly has already been said much more eloquently by folks in the late 19th and early 20th century. So think of the era of Louis Brandeis and whatnot in this country.
The last era of extreme wealth.
The last era of the last Gilded Age before this particular Gilded Age. But the basic critique, going back to the Brandeis era, the worry is in an economy dominated by a small number of market-dominant monopoly firms or oligopolistic firms, right? There are a number of concerns with this. One is the monopolist, because they control the market, can set the terms of entry for other potential competitors and producers. So it's not the strength of your business idea or the quality of your product or innovation that is determining which firms are in the market. It is once there's a gatekeeper that can keep other people out for its own self-interest, that's already then a problem for other producers. There's a lot of empirical research now, so that's on other producers. Second harm for workers. There's a lot of empirical research that documents very well in the modern era today. Wages are lower in concentrated industries. Job mobility is lower in concentrated industries. The ability of workers to essentially trade up, to build skills in one job, move to another job, and get a higher wage, and then move to another job and get a higher wage is lower in market-dominant industries. This is as much true in, say, fast food as it is in sort of white-collar service professions, actually. So there's a labor cost to monopoly. And then the last thing is, I'm a political scientist, so I have to talk about politics a little bit. Even in the Brandeis era and today, there's a real concern about a political cost to monopoly. Because if you think about it, a firm that has that much control over economic outcomes also naturally, by virtue of that control and its own wealth generated, has a tremendous latent political influence. Now, they may choose not to get involved in politics, but that's because we are lucky that they have chosen not to, as opposed to because there's some structural constraint. And so for Brandeis a century ago and for people today, one of the worries is market-dominant firms, because of the power they control in the marketplace, also have an outsized influence or potential to outsizedly influence policy, which then raises a whole host of other questions that we might be worried about.
Well, so one of the articles that was on the syllabus for these folks last week was Branko Milanovic writing his recent book,
very good.
Passage about Adam Smith and asserting, essentially, if I get it right, remember to get it right, my memory's not photographic, like the health of a society is measured by the economic well-being of the greatest percentage of it, something like that. I'm looking at my students, we were talking, like that level.
Yeah.
So if, okay, the really rich are getting a lot richer faster, and then everybody else is kind of like downwardly mobile, less likely to live the American dream and make more money than their parents or grandparents did through grit and hard work and whatever. Yeah. The social costs of that, though overall economic growth may be good, and some may be profiting handsomely, the thesis is concentration of market power in monopoly in the extreme is maybe really good for them, but kind of bad or middling for everybody else.
And just to say, since this is a business and society class, one thing that's so interesting about this is, so you can imagine all kinds of, there are many different kinds of normative critiques of that kind of concentration of wealth and power. From a competition standpoint, what's interesting is a lot of this critique is from the standpoint of the market. Like the argument is that even if you're in Adam Smith's sense, a believer in free markets and dynamism and innovation and capitalism of that strain, even on those terms, market-dominant firms are a problem for market capitalism. And this goes back to Brandeis and others, right? These folks are market capitalists in a lot of sense, right? They're explicit about it. They believe in the role of business. They believe in the importance of business as a vocation, as a social profession, as a profession that is important to the uplift of society writ large, right? And from that standpoint, they're worried about what it means for dynamism, creativity, innovation, et cetera, to have an economy dominated by a small number of monopolist firms.
Yeah. So, in that, we've just danced around it here for the first time. We're living in intensely politically polarized times, and to even entertain questions about the proper relationship between business and society, we need to we need to be fluent in the terms of the debate. And so for you to say market capitalists emphasizing the importance of antitrust avoiding monopolies is a way to say what we're talking about now kind of interestingly cuts across the aisle in terms of our default positions politically. But to say that, then I want to go back to the second point you made about kind of the legal infrastructure and the regulatory oversight. So let's say we can form a bipartisan coalition to say concentration of market power by a platform firm is going to be bad for other producers. It might be bad for consumers in different ways. So let's fix it. And then, how do we fix it? And then you start to talk about the framework of laws and statutes by which and through which that market concentration could be addressed by the government in the interest of society. Okay, so talk us through that in a little bit more detail, if you would, please.
Yeah, great.
This is what you've just been doing in D.C.
Yeah, totally. So it is a patchwork, right? You've got, for any given sector, right, you're going to have state and local laws particular to your state and locality, and then you're going to have a host of national regulations. And in this context, what we're talking about is sort of antitrust, anti-monopoly regulations of various kinds. So this is, think like Federal Trade Commission. It is like the big sort of kind of central institution at the federal level. Also a product of the first Gilded Age, right? It's in 1914, the Federal Trade Commission Act is passed, and you see the creation of these entities charged with a very broad mandate to prevent what the Sherman Act calls unfair methods of competition. That's all it says. The Sherman Act is very broad. And the idea is that the FTC, populated staff by economists, by lawyers, by sector-specific experts, and so on, part of their mandate across administrations across the decades has been to keep tabs on what are the new forms of policy and sort of the dynamics in different sectors, and to issue general regulations and enforcement actions to ensure fair competition. We wrote this article in 2019, so it was a while ago, right? And actually, since then, you've seen some pretty big changes in competition law and policy. The FTC, over the last several years, has brought a number of actions, including some direct antitrust lawsuits against Amazon and other platform firms. But they've also issued, for example, a pretty big new rule issued a few months ago in the summer against, for example, non-compete clauses. So this goes to the labor piece I mentioned. If you were to try to solve some of the labor problems, FTC has a new final rule that went into effect a few months ago that bans outright in your employment contracts a non-compete clause, which would essentially bar you from going to work for a peer company that might offer you a better wage for the set of skills that you have. So all of which is to say, I think there's actually a lot of legal authorities in the federal government that we've only just started to dust off over the last few years to try to, take a stab at some of these platform dynamics. I think it remains to be seen, how many or which of those policies continue, if any, because they are sort of subject to the different presidential administrations. The other entity I should mention, in addition to the FTC, there are a few others, but just so you all have a sense of the landscape, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is another big one. The Department of Justice Antitrust Division is another big one, which brings lawsuits on antitrust issues. And then I should mention the National Labor Relations Board, which actually has a lot of broad power on labor law. Going back to the Fishered Workplace example about this outsourcing of functions, one of the reasons why that was possible before is there was an ambiguity in labor law as to who counts as an employee. So why the Uber drivers don't count as employees of Uber, for example. The NLRB issued a bunch of policy changes over the last maybe 2-3 years trying to tackle that problem. Now, there too, we'll see if those policies continue. But the apparatus is there.
Yeah.
If we want to use it.
Well, let me build on something just to acknowledge and to sort of send the signal. It's like next week we'll have our resident antitrust economist, Larry White, in dialogue with the former chair of the New York City Bar Association Antitrust Committee. So we'll be on that issue. The following week, we'll be talking about labor domestically and globally in the supply chain. So foreshadowing, we're not done with this topic yet. So I want to ask you, I mean, in terms of the third element that you sketched as contributing to the rise of platform capitalism, the alliance between the patient capital investor class and the consumers. Now again, part of the problem is for those of us, before we started teaching Amazon in this class, I never really thought about Amazon. It's just, I need some new whatever. I'm going to go on Amazon.com and I'm going to buy stuff. So I'm a consumer, right? The challenge, I think, with the platform business model is that, as you briefly said earlier, I'm then not the only consumer, right? So they're selling me stuff, but they're taking my data and they're selling that and the predictive analytics, on the other side to other consumer markets, and the statutes may not be able to account for that in the same way. So I'm curious just to think, like, who are the consumers of Amazon in your view? The platform enables them to play how many different groups of people off against each other?
Yeah, and this is it's a great point on the data front. So one of the things about platform firms or monopoly market dominant firms is that, and this is one of the central worries in the anti-monopoly sort of policy universe at the FTC and elsewhere, is that one of the harms is that firms, once they achieve dominance in one market, can leverage that dominance to then become dominant in an adjacent market. And so you kind of have a snowballing of dominance across sectors. Amazon's a great example of this, right? So think about I think you all were at some point in your syllabus, I saw that the Frontline documentary on Amazon.
Yeah,
so,
last week.
Yeah, right. Okay, great. So if you think about the arc of the firm, right? Starts off as books, okay, but then the infrastructure built to deliver cheap books to consumers, then very quickly, easily, right, relatively easily, adapted to other kinds of consumer products. As the platform grows, now there's one version where we're the consumers. There's another version where we're the product, because we are generating data that the firm has very fine-grained accounting of. That data can then be sold to other consumers, which are advertising companies. In Amazon's case, Amazon actually makes more money out of its cloud services now than it does out of its actual like direct-to-consumer platform. There are all sorts of questions about the ways in which Amazon can leverage its market dominance as a consumer platform to then also generate market dominance in cloud. So there's like a whole set of debates about this. But just to say, I think you're exactly right, Matt, that there's one version of which we are the consumer and we're getting a good deal, we're in control, we have our freedom of consumer choice. There's another version of it is that we are actually in the holding pen, and and then we are the product, unbeknownst to us, right? And to your point about legal authorities, this is actually, I think, for those of you who are interested in data and technology and law and policy, I will say this is a huge area that people are really trying to wrestle with, which is what is the right legal infrastructure, legal architecture for this data question, right? What are the right restrictions for privacy, but that still enable a certain level of dynamism and innovation, right? Data can be very useful, right? It's not that we don't want any data, but we just do not have, there are smart people working on this, but the point is as a society, we have yet to land the plane on this question of what is the right set of rules and regulations for the generation, accumulation, and control over data, and the tremendous repercussions that will have, for everything from, discrimination law to, actual ability of other rival firms to get up and running.
Well, control of data. I mean, what's the status of TikTok today? There's lots of voices in that conversation. What I'm going to say, and I've been looking around the room, I haven't seen any hands up. So I'm just going to say, I've got one or two more questions that I'm going to put, and then it's over to you. So start thinking about what you want to know more about, or what you may think critically about, or what you may be curious about its significance for your kind of professional career. But so if you think Amazon, and you just said, we're not the consumer, we're the product. Oh, well, that's different. who does Amazon compete with and how in the production of us? What's that? We're talking about big data.
Yep.
But like, if we think about that is what the platform is designed to make money on, and that's the horizon.
Yep.
Whether through TikTok or what, but like at that level, who is Amazon competing with to produce the market analytics or the advertising specialization stuff that comes from us? We're the product.
Yeah, so that's an entirely different market, right? But there, you think of, you mentioned analytics companies like, so this is actually, by the way, also a big part of the real business model of Google, right? The real business model of Google is ads and analytic data from same parallel story, and so Google is one of the competitors, right, in this from a data standpoint. But the Google story is the same as the Amazon story, right? You generate a legitimately amazing product, right, such that it has actually entered our lexicon as we Google things instead of searching for things, right? So like a really great product, which then also generates so much data and knowledge for the firm that they can at a very low cost way and high success rate way then move into other spaces. And like the real engine of Google is its control over data and ads, which is why some of the litigation around ad tech in Google, like the current antitrust case against Google, which got an initial decision some months ago. That case, by the way, started under the first Trump administration. The first Trump administration's DOJ continued through the Biden administration's DOJ right up to the district court decision some months ago, was all about this question of can Google retain control over all of its ad data, and does it need to divest those two functions? And that's part of the live litigation right now.
So, well, talking about live litigation, the last one from me to you before we turn it over to the room and these bouncy mics, which are bouncing along here in the front row. I'm not asking you to read the political tea leaves. I'm asking you to sort of think as you say political scientist, but like about the political economy.
Yeah.
What do you foresee in, the next 3.5 years that these students are here at Stern? How will platform capitalism evolve, if you could speculate?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's a tough question because a lot is changing in real time. I think I'd say a couple of things. One is that this theme about data and who controls data, what's a political economy around data, what are the different business models, what are the legal architectures or lack thereof, I think it's going to be an increasingly urgent and like market-shaping, world-shaping set of debates. That's number one. Number two, I don't see the platforms going anywhere anytime soon. And so I think it'll be a real question, important thing to follow. What happens to some of the policy changes that I mentioned that we're starting to try to try to rein in some of the excesses of, or what I think of as the excesses of the platform model? Do those continue? Do they not? If they don't continue, is there a political demand for them to continue? And then the last thing I'll say, you said 3.5 years. I actually might want to take a longer view in the sense that, I mentioned the early 20th century at one point. And I really do think that's a template or a model for what kind of upheavals that we're in right now, which is when the economy structurally transforms into a very different set of dynamics, creating vast inequalities of the kind that we have now, that naturally generates a huge amount of social pressure, dissatisfaction, and political swings back and forth. Because you have a set of deep societal needs that are not being addressed either in the marketplace or in policy. And that is just unsustainable, right? Sooner or later, something breaks. And that's kind of what I think we're living in right now. And so for, not so much the next 3.5 years, but really certainly for the rest of my career, but presumably for a large part of y'all's career too, I think part of what we will be grappling with as a society is how do we build the guardrails and the practices in business, in markets, and in law to kind of address these deep inequalities and instabilities. Otherwise, we're going to keep having the kind of whiplash from policy regime to policy regime every couple of years.
Sabeel, thank you very much for that. What I'm going to do here is change the words, but not the image. People, again, this is your time. It's open forum for questions and comments. I see a hand up straight there. 1, 2, 3. Look at that. 7 hands up. Guides, please help me. This in row 4 is first.
Ready?
It's going to go like that. Well, look at that. First time it worked. So you're first. So thanks very much. Before you start, I'm just going to say, emphasizing what's on the screen. This is a time for you to ask questions of clarification. You used a lot of acronyms and alphabet soup. What are we talking about? Some people, so there's that. That's a totally legitimate question. Please help me understand. But then also, like, I hear you saying this. With all respect, I have a critical perspective or a different, a different opinion. That's also totally legit. Today and every session, this whole semester, just in general, it's critical thinking. That's what we're doing. Yep. And then again, to think like, oh, well, I'm here at Stern. I think I'm studying whatever I'm studying. What are the implications of that for me personally or professionally to seek, guidance really and expert opinion from our guests? We're doing this for the first time. Thank you very much. If you could just say your first name to introduce yourself.
Sure. Joe.
Joe, thanks. Go for it.
Sure. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the shift in the Republican Party, which began with Teddy Roosevelt as the great trust buster and eventually shifted to the Reaganomic embrace of laissez-faire in regards to mergers and acquisitions, and how that's relating to the modern-day movement of MAGA, despite the divergent approaches to both the FTC with the embrace of Lena Khan and anti-regulation with the Department of Government Efficiency.
Yeah, that's great. Are we collecting, or should I jump in?
Let's just
okay, great.
Directly.
That's great.
That's a whole 10 dissertations.
Yeah, totally. No, that's great, Joe. And I hope. I mean, look, we're like. When I'm not here doing this, I teach constitutional law and administrative law up at Cornell, and so as you can imagine, we have our hands full this last week. Lots of things to grapple with. But I'm really glad you kind of started off in the TR era, right? So one of the things that's so interesting to me about this is like pendulums swing and they swing back and forth. The turn of the 20th century was a period where actually both parties had come to they had disagreements about exactly how, but both Democrats and Republicans had come to a view that actually concentrated corporate power of this market-dominant stripe was a problem for the American economy and for American democracy. And so you had TR and the Republican trustbusters, you had Woodrow Wilson and Brandeis and the kind of Democratic trustbusters, and they had pretty big disagreements, but like at a core foundational level, kind of had a similar diagnosis about the problem. That changes in the mid-late 20th century, right, where you basically have this clash, you alluded to it, between essentially the New Deal coalition of Democrats, kind of FDR style, regulate the economy for inclusive capitalism, what have you, and the kind of Reagan-era approach. And the Republican Party, deregulation, et cetera. I would argue that deregulation ethos then became a bipartisan one, certainly in the 90s and 2000s. Part of what I think is happening now on both left and right is a kind of rediscovery of the problem of corporate power. And so it is interesting that in the suite, if you look at the suite of executive orders issued last week, this is legalese, but one of them rescinded a bunch of Biden executive orders. Interesting to my mind is one of the Biden executive orders that was not rescinded was the Biden executive order on competition. Now, could mean nothing, right? Maybe they'll just get to it in a couple weeks. But I think it's interesting because I do think there's a cross-partisan, at least from the rank and file, set of critiques about corporate power and monopoly. Now, maybe the last thing I'll say about this is, because I think we live in the real world, we have to figure this out, right? Is that any of the policies I talked about, whether or not you come from left or right, I would argue requires trustworthy, good faith public institutions to be implemented, right? So you need civil servants who are expert in economic analysis and who know what's going on in this sector, who can file, help DOJ and FTC write those lawsuits, right? And so changing policy direction is one thing. Potentially degrading the institution that is able to do policy is another thing. And that's a piece that I personally am worried about, right? For a whole host of reasons. so I don't want to like oversell the like, we have a cross-partisan, shared view on corporate power. I do think there is one, but I do think there's still pretty big disagreements between left and right at the moment on the nature of the federal government and what role civil servants ought to play in executing public policy.
Thanks for the great first question, Joe. Appreciate it. Hand up, I see right there, and then 2 or 3 in the middle, please. Guides, help me out.
Whoa.
Yeah, thanks. Your first name, please.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Eva. I just wanted to have a quick clarification question. You talked a lot about how firms have transformed. Can you just identify if you're referring to markets transforming as well, or is that just firms with the introduction of the platform business model?
Yeah, that's great, Eva. I think it's both, actually, right? So like, the nature, so if you think of like the platform as compared to like the classic mid-century like GM, the very different firms. They're culturally, sociologically, structurally very different, but they're also existing in very different markets. So I think both things are happening at the same time. But I think by focusing, part of why I'm interested in focusing on the platform firm, like the entity of the firm, is that it's, in a way, I think a deeper level of transformation. Like it's one thing to say, okay, like markets have shifted in a certain way, but to me, the changing nature of the firm feels like a more sticky and potentially durable transformation than just like a change in market tastes, right? And so that's why I'm interested in how the firm itself is transforming.
Is that fair? Okay. Next, right here. I see, please, row 5 in the middle. Christopher, thank you so much. Look at that. All right.
Good. You guys are very accurate throwing.
And if guides, could you position yourself so that microphone that Ava is still holding could be passed down and redistributed for the next question. Please, your name.
Hi, my name is Nalani.
Hey, Nalani.
I had a question about what you were saying earlier about patient capitalism.
Yeah.
And I remember you saying that in the past, like people were more likely willing to wait long term for returns. And then you mentioned modern capitalism, where like narrow investors were like willing to also wait. But like I think that like in today's society, you probably have a more mix of like people who are willing to wait and people who are not so willing to wait. So I wanted to know, how do you believe that complex like nature kind of shifts the way that we see the market, and how do you feel like it will shift the way we see the market in the future?
Yeah, that's a great catch, Nalani. And I think I agree with you that like we're living in an era of both patient and inpatient capital. And so like when you think about the dynamics of like the inpatient capital that I was talking about, sort of the pressure to cut costs, to generate like return on a quarter by quarter basis, how that leads to, for some businesses, the Fishered workplace kind of labor models, right? Outsourcing of labor, et cetera. That's still very much with us, right? At the same time as we also have a different set of investors with different pools of money who are willing to play the kind of patient game by investing in an Uber or an Amazon, or the next unicorn. So both are happening at the same time. So and I think that's a great like as we think about what are the diagnoses of what might be problematic about like 2025 era capitalism. In some ways, it's both things. We're living in both. Like we're living in the repercussions of inpatient capital, and we're living in the repercussions of patient monopoly generating capital at the same time.
Yeah.
So I think that's totally fair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take over here, right here. We're going to go on this side of the stage and then on that side of the stage. Belle, if you could over there against the wall, please. Yes, please. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dash, and I just have another question about the patient capital part.
Yeah.
You mentioned how these like service platforms, they're an example of patient platforms, or patient capital, waiting to like build market share rather than taking profit. But like from an investing perspective, couldn't you argue that these platforms would see like consistently higher returns? Like I'm pretty sure like no matter what point in Amazon's like term as a stock, right? It would return higher than like your average company that has to produce cash flow on like a quarterly basis. So I just like I guess from more of a investor perspective and like patience from there.
Yeah. I think that's fair, right? And so certainly now, as they're like in their mature form, Amazon's a great investment. There's no question about that, right? I think that the patience part, like patience in the sense of willing to forego near-term return, I think was especially true in the early days as these firms were getting up and running. So if you think about Uber, right, the early days of Uber was not actually returning a lot in the early days. And that's partly because the company was subsidizing for a long time each individual ride to make it like cheap enough that people would be willing to get an Uber and then thereby grow market share. Now it's a different story, right?
So sorry to interject, but
Yeah,
so the patient capital is mainly in terms of like profitability rather than, I guess, like your return on the valuation of the company. Is that what you mean by it?
You mean
like, because you said Uber, like this is an example of something that would be patient capital because it was losing money for a significant amount of time, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
that, like, even though an investor in Uber, like, I don't know the exact time frame, that might not be the best example, but they would typically expect like pretty high returns on the like actual like the money invested in the business and like the appreciation of that, right?
Yeah, right. I see what you're saying. Yep. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think for some of these, and we'd have to like get specific on some of these, 'cause I think for different investors there are different intentionalities. But like, so say for like the early days, the early VC investors of some of these platforms when they were just getting off the ground, the interest was ultimately in a long-term return in the sense of like eventually the company will be sold or will have a valuation that will be vastly more than what I'm putting in now. So like I'm willing to wait, right? That certainly was the case in the early days, right? Now these firms are big enough that they have both kinds of investors, right? They have like long-term investors and they have like people who just like own the stock and we're getting return on a more regular basis. I'm not sure if I'm entirely answering your question, but I think it's both.
What I would say, and this is relevant for everybody, I mean, just on this stage in the classroom before this class is Aswath Damodaran's equity valuation class. And he's very public with his opinions about the valuation of Amazon over the last 15 years, I think, or so. So that would be where I would direct you for like our resident investment guru. And again, his voice in that context is one among many, the investor's thesis who's going to say, yeah, they're not making money now, but the long-term value is there, versus the other person who's saying they haven't turned a profit in the whole 10 years. Why do we think they're going to turn a profit sometime in the future? That's a whole relevant part of this conversation about patient capital. Back there, yes, please, your name.
Hi, so Rick here. First off, I wanted to thank you for your time and just coming to speak to us. But my question is, we were talking about data and privacy and how we're not just the consumers, we're also the product. So I guess my question is, as a consumer, why should I be concerned that Amazon, let's say, knows that I like basketball or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the operative part would be as a consumer. So it might be that as a consumer, you don't care. And maybe that's fine, right? Because as a consumer, I'm getting a good deal. Look, I'm a parent. The number of times I like panic order something on Amazon because I need to get it tomorrow because I've got like a situation with the kid. Of course it's useful as a consumer. So I kind of couldn't care less if they're data binding at that point in time. But I think certainly when you go back to like the early 20th century kind of critics of monopoly and for some of the folks today, the operative thing is that we're not just consumers. We're also workers. We're also, certainly in this room, potential producers and creators of new ideas, of new firms. We're also citizens of a society. And so there are lots of other things we care about. And there are lots of other things that are potential risks or vulnerabilities or harms that may not be present today, but that we might be sort of rationally, like reasonably worried about down the line, right? And so like from a data standpoint, one of the things that I think about, just as an example, is, gosh, like what happens to our rules and norms about treating one another equally and fairly in a world where employers or other firms have access to data about me that I may or may not have actually consented to giving in the first place, and on which they could base all sorts of decisions that would affect my life without my even knowing, right? Like, because once the data is collected and out there, it is off to the races, and it is a wild west out there, and we're already entering a world where it is increasingly possible and common for job applicants, housing applications, you name it, people being automatically pre-screened and denied on the basis of data sets that are completely black box, that are the product not necessarily just of Amazon, but that are like part of this data market that we were talking about. So I mean, I'm going a bit further afield, but my point is like, as a consumer, it might be totally rational to say, this is fine, I don't care. And I think part of what my push to you all would be that to ask yourselves, when are we acting as consumers and when are we acting as with other hats where we might have other concerns?
Well, and just to connect, and you pass the mic just to next to you. But to say, related but distinct from what you've said, is their knowledge of your love of basketball. Whatever, you made it, you know. The broader point you're making is the concentration of power in the marketplace for data contributes to the decline of the middle class in America. The concentration of wealth in the hands of the few is then bad for everybody. Everybody. The majority, by Milanovich's definition, but for the majority of the people, you know, makes society worse because the largest class of people has relatively less. So that's another kind of sharp spin. It's pennies in one trade, in one transaction, but after billions of transactions and the analytics on the basis of it, the concentration of wealth and power in those markets is then bad for society. Right next to you, holding the microphone, is who? Who are you?
Hi, I'm Rebecca. So for one of our readings about the history of American corporations, it had this quote from Teddy Roosevelt that talked about the importance of the relationship between corporate and government. And I wanted to know your opinion on, how do you think these recent strong ties between big business CEOs and the government can benefit and harm not only investors, but citizens?
Yeah, that's great. Of course, we, those of you who watched the inauguration last week is, I think, quite an image to see some of our most famous CEOs on the dais alongside some of our incoming policymakers. And I mean, that's maybe unusual, but actually not that unusual because they're just not always on stage. But Jeff Bezos has access to the White House whenever he wants. Doesn't matter who's in office, right? So I think it's a really, really great question, and it goes back to the kind of the TR theme that Joe started us off on. And this, I think, connects a little bit to what you were just saying in response to Rick. So for me, I'm, cards on the table. I'm a small d Democrat, which is to say, I am personally skeptical of the concentration of unaccountable power anywhere, whether it's the unaccountable power of the platform firm or the monopolist, or the unaccountable power of a government that doesn't follow the rules, right? That isn't accountable to me or us, right? Or the unaccountable power of the random landlord who discriminates on the basis of race, gender, or sexual orientation, right? Any unaccountable power makes me personally uncomfortable, right? Because I believe as a small d Democrat that if each of us have equal moral worth as humans, we ought to expect a baseline level of treatment as a matter of right, not as a matter of benevolence. And when you have concentrated power, you might well get treated fine, but it's because of the benevolence of the power holder that they happen to treat you well, not because they have to treat you well. So all of which is to say, a world in which you have concentrated control of, in the market among some firms and some CEOs and some owner interests, and concentration of political power among a set of folks, both of those are a problem, in my view. And going back to the kind of a responsible capitalism, I mean, interestingly enough, you all read Adam Smith and so on. One read about why economists in a Smithian tradition care about market economics is precisely that it decentralizes economic power. A world in which you have competitive markets is a world in which no one firm, no one human, no one government can determine wages and prices. And that is small L liberty, which is not all that different, I don't think, personally, from small d democracy. So anyway, that's a bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but I think there's a connection between those two things.
So this is the first session of Business and Society, and we are off to the races. You people did a great job sticking with us this time.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
so much. Thank you to Sabeel Rahman. see you all in 2 weeks. Next week you'll be online. Enjoy.